There's a big social media chatter why the new government is borrowing so much money through treasury bills and treasury bonds. What is going on? If you follow Advocata Institute and our Single channel Advocata Plus, that we have been saying that about 70% of the money that we borrowed was borrowed either to pay interest or to cover up our currency depreciation. If you go to the central bank website, you can see every week, pretty much every other day, the government of Sri Lanka is raising money through treasury bills on short term and treasury bonds in a long run with maturity dates of 2028, 2032. Because what we are basically doing is we are rolling over debt. We are borrowing money to settle the borrowings that we have done few years or few months ago. So what we are doing is to settle the previous debt and the interest, we are borrowing new money to settle our previous debt. So which we call the rolling over, and as a result, every week, pretty much sometimes every day, not every day, but every week, very often, we have to borrow more and more money. And that's why you hear the popular claim by the politicians, okay, previous government borrowed money and we are settling, or you say, you know, the new government borrowed more money than we borrowed, and when we borrowed there were many infrastructure projects, but now there is no projects. The simple reason is you are borrowing not to develop anything, you are borrowing not for any investment, you are borrowing just to settle your previous debt and the interest. If you look at this graph on the pie chart, you can see the composition of our debt repayments. As you can see, a big chunk goes mainly to settle interest and the balance goes to the currency depreciation. And that's why as Advocata we always recommend to keep a tight monetary policy, because if you print more money or if you do the budget deficit financing through the central bank, which now you cannot do because of the new Central Bank Act, otherwise you will see inflation as well as economic downturn. That is the main reason why the new government borrows more and more money. And the next question comes, whether this borrowed money is also equivalent to money printing. The simple answer is no, because money printing means when the central bank issues treasury bills and treasury bonds, if they cannot raise enough money from the market, at that point the central bank buys those treasury bills and treasury bonds, and central bank buying those treasury bills and treasury bonds means they have to basically print money, because central bank do not have any deposits. So that doesn't happen at this time, because so far all the bond auctions, all the bill auctions have been oversubscribed. That means more than the government requested, there were bids offered. So government was able to subscribe all the money requirement that they required. So at this case, no money printing takes place. But the reason is basically to roll over the debt. Other popular question is, we are already in a debt suspension. We are already in a debt restructuring process and we are not supposed to pay debt till 2028. Yes, that is true. So then you may ask, then how come we are borrowing more and more money to roll over debt? But remember, our debt restructuring process at the moment and our debt suspension is mainly on the international sovereign bonds and the bilateral debt. But we have to repay our domestic debt. So the domestic debt is rolling over, and that's why we are issuing treasury bills and treasury bonds on Sri Lankan denomination or Sri Lankan rupees, and that's why the rolling over takes place. So simply, why we borrow is basically to roll over, to pay the interest and to settle the previous debt. That's what we call rolling over. If the interest rates are going up, that means we have to borrow more and more money and the debt is snowballing. And that's why we have to bring the interest rate down, but we cannot bring the interest rate down artificially. It has to be through the market forces. And also, think about it. Sri Lanka is running a budget deficit. Our income is not sufficient to cover our expenditure. So obviously, to bridge that gap, you have to borrow more and more money. And we all have heard the concept of primary balance. Primary balance is your expenditure except the interest. So over the last few years, we have been running on a primary budget surplus. That means our income was adequate for all expenditure except for the interest. So that means if our income was adequate to pay our all expenditure except the interest, we are borrowing money, as we initially mentioned, to pay the interest. Because from our expenditure, as you can see in this graph, about 50% is going for settling the interest. From our expenditure, 50%, not to settle the debt, just to pay the interest. And that's why any government has to roll it over, borrow more and more money to settle the previous debts and the interest rates. The only way that we can bring it down is we have to borrow at a lower interest rate to settle the debt which we borrowed at a higher interest rate. So then we are basically narrowing down the gap, and with that we have to grow the economy, so we bring the debt burden compared to the size of the economy, that you call the debt to GDP ratio. And that's the main reason why the new government has to borrow more and more money, and it will be the reality even for any government, because you have to constantly roll over your debt. Subscribe us, and we will see you in a new video next week.
If you are interested in seeing more content like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Advocata on all social media platforms to never miss out on our latest content. Consider supporting Advocata by becoming an individual subscriber. Gain access to our weekday media monitoring of economic news, exclusive Advocata events, and more. To learn more, visit us at support.advocata.org.